Revelation? Okay. Okay. So, okay, I just want to tell you some of my favorite things about Revelation. We're coming up on St. Francis Day this Thursday, October 4th. And I don't know if you guys do a blessing of the animals or anything for that, but we will. At the chapel at the seminary, it's pandemonium. People are going to bring in their rabbits, their cats, their dogs, and it's a focus on creation. We do have at the seminary a strong kind of environmental emphasis, and students are really interested in that. But it's based right out of the book of Revelation. One of my favorite things about Revelation is animals talk. Earthworms praise God. Everything in heaven, on earth, and under the earth praises God. All the creatures in the sea. You even have animals with souls in Revelation. The Greek word psyche, which means soul. The fish and the sea creatures are said to have that innate. So it's the opposite. I mean, you get the message sometimes in our culture that Revelation hates the earth, that it's just trying to destroy the earth. No, actually, if you look carefully at Revelation, apocalypses are using every element of creation as part of their message. We all participate in God's judgment and salvation together, and it's really kind of wonderful. That's not a Mrs. Piggle Wiggle theme, but other children's books I think are really good at having animals be part of God's plan, and Revelation has that. Oh yeah, I was just going to say, I went up to the synagogue in my neighborhood, what was it, Tuesday night was the beginning of Yom Kippur. Tuesday night was what's called Kol Nidre for Jews, the beginning of the holiest day of the year. And our local synagogue that's just 3 blocks up, just by President Obama's house, on 51st and Greenwood, called KAM Isaiah Synagogue, they have this wonderful garden out in the yard that is a garden for, they're going to give the food to the homeless shelters and food shelves and stuff. But for the high holy days services, they had their whole altar area that is called the Bima covered with like these squashes, eggplants, kale. I mean, it was beautiful. Instead of altar flowers, basically, they're doing altar vegetables. And I'm like, wow, this is very apocalyptic, because the participation of all of creation in God's bounty, God's salvation, in the healing of the world is really great. So that's one of my favorite things about Revelation that you won't hear on the radio or on the fundamentalist TV shows. Another thing I like about Revelation is all of us are priests. It's a very sort of egalitarian book. It doesn't have bishops, pastors, deacons, like some other books of the Bible do. In the book of Revelation, we are all a kingdom of priests. And this is based in the book of Exodus. In Exodus 19, there's Exodus 19 verse 6, there's a verse saying that God's people are all a kingdom of priests. And that's very much a focus in the book of Revelation. And so John's a prophet, and he wants us to be a prophetic community. He also wants us to be a priestly community. And it's here in the book of Exodus, you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. So this is actually where Martin Luther got his doctrine of the priesthood of all believers. I don't know if you've heard about that. That in Luther's time, in the 16th century, the Catholic Church was quite hierarchical, and the priests were the ones who would say the magic words over the bread and wine, and they were the only priests. But no, Martin Luther looked to Revelation and to 1 Peter, and he said no. Both of those books, the first letter to Peter, or first letter of Peter, as well as Revelation, say that everyone is a priest in this priestly people, and that's a great focus for Revelation. You've got it in chapter 5 and also chapter 20. Well, the most important thing of the book of Revelation is it's a book of hope, and that I'll just say over and over. I think if you read Revelation and get straight through it, I mean, don't get bogged down in the middle section, you will see this really is a book of hope for each one of us, hope for our world, and hope for our future in God's hands. And what that meant to people in the first century, 2,000 years ago when John was writing, that meant hope that the empire isn't going to last forever. And that was really important because Rome had on its coins and on its billboards and everything these slogans, Roma Eterna. Rome was proclaiming it was going to last forever. And John says, no, Rome is not going to last forever. Only God and the Lamb last forever. And Jesus is the Lamb. And so this is very hopeful for people who thought, it's hopeless. Rome will never come to an end. We think 30% or so of the people in the ancient world were slaves. Most of the Christians were certainly very poor. It's good news to hear that the empire isn't eternal, isn't the be-all and end-all that it claims to be. And Revelation keeps your hope going throughout the whole book. Whenever there's a really scary sequence, and that would be all these sequences of sevens, the four horsemen. Who said the four horsemen? Okay, they're part of the scary seven seals. The first four of the seven seals are these four horsemen, and they all come out with their various swords and killing mechanisms and stuff. And then there's three more after that. But in all, and then the next one, right after the seals are done, then you get the seven trumpets, and they're a little bit worse, a little bit scarier. And then after those are done, you get the seven bowls, and those are twice as bad as the trumpets. So a lot of scary stuff in the middle chapters. But the important thing is that between the 6th and the 7th, you always get this wonderful interlude of salvation. So like all of Revelation chapter 7, and here's a funny thing. Lutherans always tell me, oh, I don't know anything about the book of Revelation. I don't have anything to do with the book of Revelation. I'm like, oh, really? And then you start to get a place like chapter 7, other places. Well, it turns out it's all the songs you know from the liturgy. Worthy is Christ, the Lamb who was slain, whose blood set us free to be people again. Holy, 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 the Lord God Almighty. Handel's Messiah is based on the hymns in the book of Revelation. I mean, it's all quoting stuff you know. So actually, you as Lutherans probably know a lot about the book of Revelation. It's just that you tend to know the songs. And fundamentalists will never tell you about those. They know other parts of Revelation. But the interludes between the 6th and the 7th element, I think, are very hopeful for guiding us not to be too scared, but to have hope and to believe that we are among the people who have been redeemed by the Lamb. And we've been, if we follow the Lamb on this exodus out of the Roman Empire, out of sin, out of death, out of everything that holds us captive, then you finally come to this wonderful scene at the end, God's New Jerusalem. So it's a very hopeful book, and I think we need to reclaim it from those who say it's a book of disaster. I mean, we tried, when I was in seminary, we tried ignoring Revelation. That didn't work because people are interested in it. So if we don't study it and talk about it, then others are going to. That is the fundamentalist TV preachers. So now I think we Lutherans have to say, okay, let's look at this book and see what really is in there. And there's great stuff. Now, to be sure, there's terrible stuff as well. And I will say, I think it's not the central book of the Bible, thank goodness. And we can say there's some things in there that are very problematic, that are easy to twist in various ways. This happened already in the early church. Some people thought that they were prophets then, that New Jerusalem was going to come down in their town. This was the movement called New Prophecy or Montanism. They thought Papuza, this little town in Turkey, was where the New Jerusalem was. I mean, prophets will tell you just about anything. And there were prophets back then, too, who twisted the Bible. It's hard to know how to interpret it. I also wish the book weren't so violent. I think we have to say the violence of Revelation is problematic. It's what has sometimes encouraged fundamentalist violence on the part of Christians. I mean, we tend to think more about Muslim violence right now, but there's violence in every major religion of the world. It's when fundamentalists get a hold of a denomination or of a religion. A lot of times they think that God is calling them to kill others or to obliterate difference. And Christians have done that too. The Crusades would be the most egregious example. But, you know, last year in Norway, for example, a Christian killed, 70-some kids because he didn't want to have Muslims and others. So, and I think Revelation has sometimes been the fuel that got poured on that fire and encouraged some of that extremism and violence. And Christians have to say this is not the heart of the Bible. God does not call anyone to engage in violence. If you look at it carefully, there is no participation of God's people in anything violent. In fact, I think if you look at it carefully, what you start to see is the violence in Revelation overwhelmingly is the violence that the Roman Empire is inflicting on people. It's not the violence that God and Jesus do. Most of all, and I would read the first four horsemen as Rome. It's the empire rampaging through the world. And what John is doing then is portraying the violence of the Roman Empire in terms of these out-of-control horses that are doing terrible things to the world. And it's not Jesus that on one of those horses. Jesus is not ravaging the world. But it sometimes has been read that way, and I think we have to say the book of Revelation has been problematic in Christian history. It also tends to encourage polarization, a kind of either or. Either you're for us or against us. And I think why John does that is to try to get people to take a stand. He doesn't want you to be able to sit on the fence. He wants you, if you're really a Christian, to not participate in the Roman Empire. That's his understanding of what God calls us to do. Now, it's interesting on some of the things like eating meat that has been sacrificed to idols, because that's a theme in his letters in chapters 2 and 3. He tends to take a more extremist position than others in the Bible would. Like the Apostle Paul does in 1 Corinthians permit meat eating, and also in Romans. He says it's okay under certain circumstances to eat that meat that is sacrificed, because that was the only kind of meat you could get in the cities of the Roman Empire. It had all been sacrificed to some pagan god. So if you didn't want to participate in that, you had to be a vegetarian. And basically, Revelation says you have to be a vegetarian, and you cannot eat this meat that's been sacrificed. But Paul takes a more middle position on that. Revelation is an extremist. And I don't know whether to say, right wing or left wing or what. Whether he's I don't even know who to have the analogies, but he's at one end or the other of the spectrum, in a way that I think that this message needs to be tempered by others in the Bible. Now, the fact that he does take these tough and courageous positions means that this has been, in some ways, the most important book for people who have been oppressed. Like, this is the only book of the New Testament that condemns the slave trade, for example. So it was very important in the abolition of slavery in the 19th century. It's been very important in struggles for justice, like in South Africa during the 1970s, 80s, the apartheid struggle. They looked to the book of Revelation because in Revelation, government is called a beast, an evil, evil beast, whereas in Romans 13, Paul says government is instituted by God. So it's good that in the New Testament there's a spectrum of positions, but Revelation takes a pretty hard-headed position on things. And that, I think we have to be careful. That is to say, don't love the people that John loves, but don't necessarily hate the same people that he hates. You don't have to have as much hate as he sometimes seems to be encouraging, because I think we are in a different position, and we're not the same kind of prophets that he was. So there's aspects of the book that are problematic, and we got to admit it. But overall, I want to say this is a wonderful book, and I just want to finish with talking about a little bit of the humor in this key character of Jesus, the Lamb. So will you look with me at chapter 5? Let's take 5 minutes, and then I'll let you go. How's that? Okay, so in chapter 4, here's how the plot of Revelation goes. I'll just do a quick plot summary. Chapters 1 to 3, you're on earth. Then chapter 4, you go up to heaven, and from that point on, there's these various layers. Heaven, earth, underworld. And all the singing takes place up in heaven. Now, the key thing I'm going to talk about in my sermon is that in chapter 21, basically, heaven comes down to earth. The throne of God and of the Lamb come down to earth, and I think that's a key moment. I'm doing it as a dotted line because it doesn't actually say earth, but it says the throne of God and the Lamb come down. New Jerusalem comes down. But anyway, in chapter 4, you go up to heaven, and then 4 and 5 is this amazingly wonderful throne room vision of the worshiping that takes place in the heavenly throne room, the heavenly court, which I think is, some scholars at least say this is because this helps the people realize the emperor isn't the one who sits on the throne and is in charge of the world. The emperor did have a throne in Rome. They knew that. And they sort of knew, like we kind of know what it'd be like to go visit Queen Elizabeth. They knew what it'd be like to go visit the emperor. But John is basically saying it's even better to go visit God in God's throne room. And here's what it looks like. So there's jewels and crowns and music and everything. All the living creatures, the animals are worshiping God. And then chapter 4 closes with God is holding this scroll. Okay, would somebody read 5, verses 1 to 5? Do we have a volunteer? How about you? You made eye contact with me. That's okay. You, yes. My students learn, never look up. If you make eye contact, you're going to get called on.
Don't tell them that.
Chapter 5.
1 through 5. Then I saw a scroll in the right hands of the one who was sitting on the throne. There was writing on the inside and the outside of the scroll, and it was sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a strong angel who shouted with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to break the seals on the scroll and open it?"
Okay, so this is the dilemma. There's a scroll and no one is worthy to open it. Who's going to be worthy? Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
But no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll and read it. Then I began to weep bitterly because no one was found worthy to open the scroll and read it. But one of the 24 elders said to me, "Stop weeping. Look, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the heir to David's throne, has won the victory. He is worthy to open the scroll."
Okay, so the problem is nobody's worthy to open the scroll. Aha, the Lion of Judah is worthy to open the scroll. This is an Old Testament image, a lion. And you're picturing this mighty, mighty lion is going to come in. If you look at all these old apocalypses in my 2,000 pages, there's lions, there's other animals with claws. Rome is imaged as an eagle with talons, there's bears, there's really scary animals that can do things. Okay, but what do we get? So we're set up, we're going to get the lion, great. The lion's going to come and open it. Somebody read verse 6.
Then I saw a lamb that looked as if it had been slaughtered.
Okay, so this is the humor. Get it? I mean, he sets you up to expect a lion. All the apocalyptic tradition would expect a lion. Instead, you get a lamb. And it's not just the Greek word lamb, our omnos, it's the diminutive. It's our neon. Anything with an eon at the end is like a little lamb. So it's like lambkin or fluffy or lamb chop. You know? So you're expecting this lion who's going to be able to open the scroll, and instead you get lamb chop. He's standing, that is, he's raised, as though he's been slain, that is, crucified. So it's Jesus, the risen Christ, who's been crucified, now imaged as this little lamb. And he's the one, then, who's worthy to open the scroll. I mean, this completely overturns people's expectations. And from this point on in the book of Revelation, there's 26 more references to this lamb. This is the first reference to him. It's this lamb who we are to follow, this Jesus who has been crucified and now is standing. He is like the new Moses in the book of Revelation. He's the one who's going to lead us on this Exodus. But it entirely overturns the idea of might and power and what really counts that people had learned in the system they lived in. Rather, the one who is worthy to open the scroll and able, because now he's going to start opening the seals, is one who is vulnerable, who conquers. I mean, the Greek word conquering, I have an assignment for you. When you go into the church, I saw that embroidered on one of your kneeler cushions is this Greek word nika, which is like Nike, which means conquer. Nike tennis shoes, I don't see any of them here, but those mean conquering. And it's not just athletic conquering, it's military conquering. So Rome taught people to think that might and power and the most weapons and the most violence is what really conquers. Revelation through this lamb teaches us to understand that conquering is something completely different. It's what Jesus did by dying and then by being raised by God. And this model of conquering through this love, this vulnerable love, I think is what sustains us through the book of Revelation. If you look at this scene of the lamb here, is absolutely central. And if you follow that lamb then through the course of the book, you see that it is not violence and power that conquers. It's rather faithfulness to this lamb and his love that sustains you through the whole book. And in fact, then in chapter 12, we are called conquerors, which would have been incongruous for the readers of this book. They never would have thought of themselves as conquerors because they knew that Nike, Nika, that banner, that's what the Roman soldiers carry on their trophies and their flags. Nika means military might, and the book of Revelation teaches you to understand yourself as a conqueror through being faithful to the Lamb and following him, and by your courageous testimony or your witness. We don't have time to talk about witnessing and testimonies, but the book of Revelation, as one of my favorite commentators says, a guy named Pablo Richard, who's a South American Roman Catholic priest, he says what Revelation teaches us is the power of testimony to change the world. And he knows, he lived through the Pinochet government in Chile. I mean, when Allende was overthrown, he was one of the people who tried to speak out. And he believes that what Revelation, in using this word testimony or witness over and over, is telling us And Revelation 12 says that we have conquered Satan. We, that's all of us, by the blood of the Lamb, that is by being faithful to Jesus, and by the word of our testimony. Christians are called to speak out. We are called to have the courage to give our witness, and that will actually change the world. That actually conquers Satan. So part of the hopefulness of this book is the important role that it gives to each one of us to be followers of the Lamb, to give our testimony. Wow, I'm getting so excited about Revelation now. I can hardly wait to teach it again. I'm not teaching the class this semester. Okay, thank you, everybody.